Chapter 59. The old man marched swiftly up the ramp to the palace gatehouse. The immaculate guard stepped out of his cubicle. "How can I help you, sir?" he said, addressing the distinguished gentleman in his gray raincoat. "I am Captain Nakabashi of the Imperial Bodyguard, retired. I have an urgent matter for the head of the household. Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No," said Nakabashi, offering him his papers. "I do not, but it is an emergency of the highest importance." The guard looked at the documents. Sure enough, they were those of an Imperial bodyguard retired 10 years before. "I will call my captain to advise," he said. "Very good," said Nakabashi. He put his hand inside his outer suit pocket. The necklace seemed to absorb his body heat and reflect it back to him. His whole side felt warmed by it. Perhaps it was the magic of legend. A captain was trotting down the slope towards them. He was bowing. "Captain Nakabashi, it is an honor," he said. "How may I help you?" "I must see the head of the household, as I must have audience with the Emperor. It is of national importance." "This way, sir," said the captain. "I am already ordered to admit you." "Very good," said the old man, bowing with his seniority of age. He felt a wave of relief sweep over him. He might just be able to achieve the impossible and deliver the treasure to the Emperor. He walked quickly through the halls he had known so well. They had been newly built when he had first worked there, and remained seemingly unchanged since he had departed a decade ago. He walked flanked by the Imperial Guard to Private Audience Room 4. 2 guards were standing behind the Emperor, and his detail of 2 men stood close by. 2 advisors Nakabashi did not recognize flanked him on either side. Nakabashi bowed as low as he could. "Your Imperial Majesty, I must speak with you alone." The Emperor nodded, and the room emptied. The door clicked close. "Yoshi," said the Emperor, beaming now. "It has been so long. How are you, old friend?" "I am very well, Your Imperial Majesty. I have come to return the Yasakani no Magatama to you." He put his right hand into his jacket pocket and lifted out the necklace. He took a step forwards and bowed, offering the jewel to the Emperor in his cupped hands. The Emperor stepped forward and took it, a wide smile crossing his face. "So, your son is winning the day." Captain Nakabashi stood up. "I fear he is in great peril." The Emperor nodded gravely. "So are we all." He put on the necklace. "At least now I can say I am truly crowned. That much danger is now past." He clapped his hands, and the doors opened. "Let us make tea together, for this is surely a moment for celebration." The guards and the advisor's eyes were wide with amazement. The Emperor was wearing the Yasakani no Magatama, a treasure no one other than priests had seen for more than half a millennium. It glowed like wet seaweed. Denny looked at Akira and at Jim. "Are we really taking Yoda with us?" "Yes," said Jim, "unless you can suddenly speak Japanese and just happen to be carrying permission to blow up Tokyo." "Okay," said Danny, grinning manically. Yamamoto was pushing something into Akira's hand. It was an old pistol. "Take this, kid. It won't let you down if you need it." Akira passed it to his short arm and tried it for size. "Thank you," he smiled. "I remember this," he said, gripping the rubber handle of the snub revolver. "It used to be much bigger." "Let's go, guys," said Reese. 2 black Toyota Crowns were waiting in the office block driveway, 3 stories underground. Jim got in with Reese. They slammed the limo doors. "Hey there," said Reese. "Do you mind if I smoke?" The driver looked around worriedly. "No English, no English," he said apologetically. "Good," said Reese, not apparently about to smoke. "We can probably talk. What the hell was in that gold box we found?" he asked, as the car pulled away towards a ramp heading up to the road above. "The Japanese crown jewels." "Oh," said Reese, "is that right?" "I'm afraid so." "And that's what this is all about?" "Oh, yes," said Jim. "That's kind of crazy." "You can say that again." "And the colonel is your girlfriend, right?" "Right." "That's what Danny thought. He's kind of disappointed." "He's brighter than he looks," said Jim. "And where does Godzilla come into the picture? Do you mean literally, or do you mean Kim?" "No, it was kind of a joke." "Got it," said Jim, with a sinking feeling in his gut. They emerged into the bright Tokyo sunlight. "I hate this bit." "You mean the going into action?" said Reese. "That's the one." It's not as bad as getting hit, said Reese. I'm not sure, said Jim. I can't remember those bits clearly. You've been hit before? Jim pulled the hair on the crown of his head to one side. That was just a week or so ago. Reese could see a thin red scar. It's healed pretty well. Jim nodded. How about you? Not once, said Reese. All I get is abrasions. That must be skill, said Jim. I hope so, said Reese. I like to think that, but you kind of know it's luck. Luck is good. I got a question for you. Okay. How do investment bankers act? I want to walk in there and look credible. That's easy, said Jim. Just swagger in like you think you're some death-dealing Navy SEAL killing machine in an expensive suit. That's pretty much average investment banker behavior. If you can come across like an obnoxious jerk at the same time, you'll be completely credible. I can do that, he grinned. I hope you didn't mind me calling you Yoda, said Danny, now remorseful for dissing the professor. No, said Akira. I took it as a compliment. That's good, said Danny, because it was meant to be one. I think it was meant as an insult, said Akira, but I chose to take it as a compliment. Right, said Danny. I'm sorry about that, and I hope we're cool, Professor. Are we? Akira scanned him with his inscrutable gaze. We're cool, he said finally, a smile flickering across his face. Brandon watched Central Tokyo pass his window. A lot of the adverts had American stars promoting booze, cigarettes, and mobile phones. They were photographed in such a way it was hard to recognize them. In some cases, their eyes appeared to have been touched up and made to look Japanese. My urban warfare skills are pretty shaky, he said finally to Casey. Mine too, said Casey. This is going to be real sketchy. Chapter 60. Jim felt like a terrorist. They entered the office building armed to the teeth, surrounded by innocent, unarmed people utterly unprepared for what might happen. They were passing through their normal world, set on a course that would probably erupt into extreme violence. Keep walking, he said silently to the people who passed him. Don't look back. Reese, Brandon, Danny, and Casey did look like investment bankers, the sort who went running at 5 a.m. for an hour before getting to work at 7. Unlike the boozy, often corpulent British bankers, there was always a cadre of young American bankers who used their looks and arrogance to navigate around the world of finance. To the casual eye, the SEALs perfectly fitted the mold. Only their faces gave them away. Their features hinted at a level of fitness even the most die-hard gym patron could never attain. Only people constantly on the move had hard, muscled faces like theirs. If Jim's heart hadn't been pounding so hard, he would have laughed. He could have taken the SEAL team to any investment bank and walked them into million-dollar jobs. They were perfect. Kim had never dealt with an American bank before. He had avoided it. They had a bad reputation. They relied on contracts and pulling tricks. They were paid too much to be easily swayed by favors, like women and booze. They thought that because you did not say no, you had said yes. They thought a deal could be done by flying in, making a couple of presentations, and emailing over a contract. He wanted nothing to do with such business practices. He relied on the Japanese system of relationships built over years, unwritten and unspoken deals made over dinner, whiskey, and cigarettes. That was a long, subtle game he was good at, and at which he won. Business was war for the Americans, and they never respected an ally, let alone an enemy. Now he had no choice. He didn't like the look of the room. The bankers looked like nightclub bouncers, and the junior Americans seemed angry. The translator didn't feel right either. His shriveled arm repulsed Kim. It made him feel queasy. So, gentlemen, down to business. How can you help me? Reese had taken the senior spot and knew it was his role to speak. Well, to kick off, I'd like to bring in my analyst here to give us an overview of the situation. Go ahead, Jimmy. Jim's nose flared. His lips pursed and drew back into a rictus smile. Thank you, Reese, he said, his British accent surprising Kim. The situation is this. He pulled his pistol. He didn't raise his voice. You've got my girl upstairs in your damn zoo. Kim rocked back in his chair and held his hands up. And you're taking us up there right now, or I'm going to blow your brains out. Very good, said Reese, grinning. He grabbed Kim's shoulder, his other hand on his briefcase of weaponry. Let's go." "No trick," said Brandon quietly in Kim's ear, "or I'll snap your neck." Kim said nothing. He had turned the stone on his cufflink and was now regretting it. "There is no woman in my zoo," he said, resetting the stone and switching off the alarm. If his guards intervened now, he would be shot. "Who do you think I am?" "Just do as you're told," said Jim, "and you might get out of this alive." Kim could see they knew where they were going. "Open the lift, please," said Casey, looking at Kim as though a negative response would mean instant death. Kim placed a cufflink over the call panel, which lit up. In a moment, there was a ding, and the door opened. His secretaries watched them enter the lift, bowing. There was only one floor on the panel, and Kim pressed the button, then swiped his cuff over the control. The doors closed, and the lift rose. Down in the control room, they watched the screens. Kim had set the alarm, then switched it off. They didn't know what to do. Wherever he went, the cameras were strangely blurred, and the scene was hard to decipher. Kim fingered the cufflink. He would set the alarm as soon as the Americans started to leave. His men would intercept them at the lift in his office suite floor, and he would have a chance to escape. Before then, he might convince them they had made a big mistake. Thank the gods the woman was gone. The lift doors opened. "Wow," said Danny, trying not to gawp at the zoo. "This way," said Jim, looking down the aisle. "You've made a mistake," pleaded Kim. "Why would you think I keep anything but animals here?" The animals were making a spectacular din. Brandon's attention was on the gorilla standing by the bars, staring soulfully at him. "Right there," said Jim, but the cage was empty. "Oh shit, she's gone." "Not gone," said Kim. "Never here." "Where have you taken her?" Jim pulled the gun from his pocket and pressed it against Kim's forehead. "Tell me, or you have seconds to live." In desperation, Kim rotated the stone in the cufflink. The cameras came on in the zoo. Through the distortion, the operators could make out that something bad was happening. They hit the security alarm. "I don't know what you mean," cried Kim. "I don't know who you are talking about. I don't know where your girlfriend is." He was sobbing. "I'm here," came a muffled voice. Jim looked into the cage. The voice was coming from the far corner. Kim made a lunge for Jim's pistol, but Danny socked him in the side of the head and knocked him to the ground. "Stay there," he ordered Kim. A board slid out from between the shelf and the cage bars, and a head poked up awkwardly from the gap. "This is a freaking hard maneuver," said Jane, her hands appearing next. She began to squeeze her body through the small space. "This is way tight," she complained. "That's better," she reported as she worked her butt out. "The cage key is in the guy's cufflinks. Take them off and wave them over the lock." Jim bent down and took them out of Kim's shirt sleeves. He ran to the cage and waved the cufflinks over the lock. There was a clank. Jane pushed the door open. "Didn't expect to see you," she said, smiling. "Thanks," said Jim. Jane took a cufflink and walked over to Kim. She pulled him to his feet. "Come with me," she said, dragging him to the gorilla cage. "We might need him," said Jim. "No deal," said Jane, Kim staggering behind. The monkeys in the cage beyond were screeching at the tops of their voices, and the birds further back were hooting and squawking in alarm. "Please don't," he begged. She unlocked the gorilla cage and slung Kim in. He cried out as he hit the floor. "No!" he screamed, scrambling up as the cage slammed shut. The gorilla ambled over to him on its knuckles, took him by the arm, and pulled him into its lap. It wrapped its arms around him, crushing him. Kim cried out as he felt a rib crack under the pressure of the embrace. "Sorry, I can't take you with me," said Jane, pouting at the gorilla. She turned to Jim and the Sills. "Let's get out of here." Reese threw Jane his pistol and took out the compact machine gun from his case. "Hi, Professor," he said as they trotted to the lift. "Hi, Jane-son," said Akira. Jim swiped the cufflinks on the lift call panel, and the doors opened. The cries of the animals were deafening. The lift descended. When the doors opened again, men with stun batons were waiting for them. The security guards reeled back at the sight of a lift full of heavily armed men, machine guns pointing at them. They backed away. The SEALs exited the lift in tight formation. The main lift bank was across the atrium. A man with a pistol stepped out of a doorway and aimed. Brandon cut him down with a burst of fire. The men with batons turned to run. Jane was paying one particular attention. She jumped forwards and tripped him as he turned to escape, then wrenched the stun gun from his hand. "I remember you," she said. She stuck the baton between his legs and pressed the switch. He let out a howl and spun around on his back. She didn't know whether he was looking at her consciously or was out cold, but she pressed the button again anyway. A spasm twisted and shook his body. She straightened. "Let's go." Reese was already heading for the main lift. "Was that necessary?" asked Jim as he passed her. "No," she said, "but it felt good." A lift door opened and they bundled in. A secretary tumbled out, screaming. They took up a fire formation in the lift as they waited for the door to close. The SEALs didn't press the door close button because it never worked in the U.S. Akira pressed it, and the door shut immediately. The express lift would take them down 58 floors in 2 minutes. Then all they had to do was make a 50-meter dash outside to freedom. The lift was slowing. It was stopping at the 52nd floor. They braced to open fire. The doors opened, and they saw a group of men with their backs to them, bowing. Another group of men and women were bowing to them in farewell. They turned to the left, and the men with machine guns. They leapt back and stared agog, frozen to the spot. The lift door closed. "Bloody hell," muttered Jim. It was stopping at the 50th floor. They braced themselves. The secretaries outside the lift shrieked, and one threw her Starbucks into the air, showering the others with latte. They fled. "Stay focused," said Reese, as the lift slowed to the 40th floor. As the door opened, Brandon, who was crouching, fired through the gap. The other SEALs opened up as the doors slid open. They burst out into the corridor over the 2 felled armed guards. Reese and Casey took the hallway beyond. "Clear!" they shouted, turning and running back. The doors closed again. The lift was picking up speed. "Maybe this time it'll go the whole way down," said Brandon. Jim looked at the TV screen above the doors. It was showing the financial news. The yen was rallying. The lift started to slow. "Here we go," said Reese. Jim kissed Jane. The doors started to open. Brandon was straining to see any movement, and as soon as the gap was wide enough, he rolled through it. They piled out, scanning around them. "Clear!" shouted Reese. They ran in formation for the escalator that would take them down to the main lobby and entrance. 2 security guards were looking up at them. They were armed but made no attempt to pull their guns. The team raced down the escalators. Then it was only 20 meters to the main doors. Brandon and Danny took position at the bottom of the moving stairway, and immediately there was a burst of gunfire from behind. The plate glass window near the entrance shattered, and glass showered to the floor. The SEALs opened up against the pistol fire with a crackle of machine gun. The fat old security guards threw themselves down and held out their arms in blind surrender to whoever was firing. Reese and Jane shot out more windows directly ahead, opening up an escape route only meters away. "Go!" shouted Casey. They ran as he and Danny fired into the space behind the escalators where the attack had originated. There was no returning fire. Casey and Danny were running backwards, covering the rest of the team. "Where's Yamamoto?" shouted Jim, hurtling through a shattered window and skidding down a polished granite sill. "There!" yelled Akira. Jim looked across the plaza. 6 off-road bikes were parked behind a black Harley, all with helmeted riders, engines running. They sprinted to the bikers who were revving their engines. Jim jumped onto the pillion of a bike and grabbed the rider around the waist. It was a woman. Shit, he had just enough time to think as the bike lunged forwards from the curb. She had a red and yellow tattoo on her neck, partly covered with strands of hair that had fallen out of her helmet. He closed his eyes in terror as the bike hurtled recklessly through the traffic. Whose idea was it to hire these maniacs to get them away? Jane jumped on the back of the Harley. She wondered who the old guy in the half-helmet was. "Nice bike," she said. "Domo." He coaxed the bike into roaring off sedately. "You again," said Stafford as he opened the door to Smith. "I'm afraid so." "Do come in. Are you planning to become a permanent fixture?" "That's not a bad idea," said Smith. "Certainly beats my little pad in Brixton." "Very good," said Stafford. "And what delights are we to expect tonight?" "The usual," said Smith. "A triad raid, perhaps, or maybe a North Korean blitzkrieg. Possibly even another ninja onslaught." "Jolly good." Stafford closed the door. "And will you be dining?" "I've eaten," said Smith, "though a plate of baked beans on toast won't come amiss later." "I'm sure we can stretch to that." "I'll help with the washing up," said Smith. "That won't be necessary. Do you have laundry?" "I've got that covered, Bertie." "I really do wish you wouldn't call me that." "Sorry, Stafford, I keep forgetting." "That's much better." Chapter 61. Jim felt uncomfortably powerless on the back of the bike as it wove in and out of the traffic. It was as if the riders had entered their own private race and were cutting through the traffic to win a bet. There didn't seem to be anyone in pursuit. What was the point of attracting attention to yourself once you had got a certain distance away? Holding on to the rider with one hand while clutching a heavy briefcase with the other was tough physical exercise, which he was finding hard to manage. He thought about jumping off at a red light, but it was never clear whether a red light was going to be obeyed or not. Jim had no idea where they were or where they were going, but he was hoping devoutly that the trip would end soon. The biker's jacket said Happy Foxes and sported a cheeky babyish face of a manga fox grinning mischievously. The bike reared up on its forks, and he gripped the girl's midriff with all his might. If he came off the back, his brains would splatter over the pristine Tokyo tarmac. Jane was admiring the Tokyo landscape as it floated by. The friendly old guy had given her a half-helmet. She sat back in a seat, her feet up on the fold-out rests, one hand on the grip. It was good to be free. The other bikes were long gone. She hadn't expected to see Jim with a bunch of SEALs, or for that matter, the professor. It felt strange to be rescued. She considered herself, as always, out on her own. It didn't matter if she was part of a team or even an army. She was no one's responsibility but her own. Jim was the guy with everything, and he was stupid to stick his neck out for her. If anyone was going to spring themselves from a fix like that, it was her. Jim could have easily got them all killed. She realized it was dumb for her to be angry with him. He hadn't complained when she had fished him out of the Congo jungle, so why should she be angry with him for getting her out of trouble? Yet she was, and that was that. They were riding beside the moat of the palace. It was an enormous entrenchment, and she marveled at it as they rolled by. She grinned to herself as the wind blew on her face. The sky was blue. It was a perfect day in Japan. Yamamoto read the sign as they passed it. 1 person killed on the road today in Tokyo. He wondered how many people would be born in Tokyo that day, how many boys would kiss a girl for the first time, how many would fall in love. They should build a sign that told everyone that, too. Jim jumped off the bike the moment it screeched to a halt at the underground entrance to Yamamoto Towers. His body was trembling, and his feet were happy to be on the ground. The rider pulled off her helmet. She was a tall, beautiful woman, whose long black hair fell onto her delicate leather-padded shoulders. "Couldn't you have gone any faster?" he exclaimed. He put the briefcase down and forced a smile. "You scared the shit out of me." The girl laughed. "You're funny," she said, and looked away from him as the other bikes drew up. The last of the Happy Foxes came down the ramp with Danny. "Woohoo!" he yelled. Brandon's biker had somehow got onto his shoulders. She was waving her arms around and shouting. Where the hell is Yamamoto? Jim wondered. Akira closed his eyes and opened them again. His rider was still looking at him through her visor. She took her helmet off. She had red hair, big eyes, and a long, thin face. She was a beauty. "Fox with 5 tails," she said, cocking her head. "Your hair is turning white." "Turning white?" She touched his head with her slender fingers and ruffled his hair. "Yes, the roots of your hair have turned white as snow." She pointed at her wing mirrors. "See?" He bent down to peer at himself. Sure enough, the first millimeter of his jet-black hair was white. The stress had turned him into an old man. He straightened as he heard the engine of the Harley fill the underground space. "Quickly," he said. "You must take me to my father." "Jump on, Kitsune." "Kitsune," he said. "Me?" He clambered on. "Never hurt me," she said, peeping at him over her shoulder. "I will never hurt you," he said. "Never go away." She set off with a jump and a high-toned clatter. "Finally!" exclaimed Jim, striding over to the SEALs and their riders, who whooped and hollered as Yamamoto and Jane drove down the ramp. The engine of the Harley filled the cavern with its roar. "Where the hell is the professor going?" shouted Jim, waving his arms at the bike as it passed. Jane had jumped off the Harley and was high-fiving the SEALs. "I was wondering where you'd got to," he said to her as she clapped with Reese. "Traffic!" She offered Jim her palm. Jim fancied a kiss, but he high-fived her clumsily, and everyone clapped. She turned back to the SEALs. "Guys, we've got to get straight to the embassy." "What?" protested Jim. "Jim, we've just been in a first-class diplomatic incident. We've got to get onto U.S. soil right away." He took her by the waist and kissed her. She didn't resist, but neither did she reciprocate much. He let her go. "Later," she said, giving him a look. "American Embassy," she told her rider. Jim's biker had obviously understood the conversation, because she shouted something to them all. They saddled up, and in a deafening storm of engine noise, took off. The sound of the engines died away, leaving behind nothing but the ambient hum of the equipment that pulsed and rattled in the depths of the building. His rider was standing by her bike, sucking a mint. "What's your name?" he asked her. "Kuda." "Hi, Kuda," he said. "Seems like we're the only ones left." "Want to play?" she said. Jim looked twice at the willowy girl in metal-encrusted knee-high boots with black and red leathers. She was holding a Sony PSP in her hand. He realized his pistol was not on safety. He took it from his pocket, flipped the catch, and put it back. Kuda didn't blink. "Let's go inside." He smiled at her. "What games you got?" "Final Fantasy XX, Bubble Trouble, Extreme 5. "Great. We could go to Akihabara and shoot zombies." She held up her helmet as if to put it on. "Got one of those for me?" "Yes." "Let's go then." The last of the creatures were coming at them. Kuda was wielding her pump-action shotgun with precision and expertise. Jim had caught on slowly, and finally got up to speed in the time it had taken to pump 10,000 yen into the machine. The robot dragon-human combo super baddie was suddenly on the game screen. He was saying something in Japanese that was clearly a final challenge. He was carrying some limp girl in his gigantic talons. "Shoot at his middle eye when it opens," said Kuda, blasting at the floating lightning bolts that cascaded towards them. The eye opened. Jim shot and missed. Kuda shot, and the monster shook backwards. A small amount of energy left its power bar. Jim's phone rang. "Bugger," he muttered, putting the red plastic shotgun into its holster. He fed the machine some more 100-yen coins. "I've got this," said Kuda, blasting away. Jim answered the sat phone. "Are you okay, Evan-san?" said a worried Akira. He must be able to hear the gunfire down the phone, Jim thought. "Yeah," he said. "The guns?" "Just zombies. I'm in an arcade." "Yamamoto-san and I were concerned. Are you returning?" "Yes," said Jim. "Just keeping myself busy." So, said Akira. "When?" "As soon as I've killed the super boss." "Gambate kudasi." "Thanks," said Jim, wondering what it meant. He hung up and picked up his gun. The eye of the super boss opened. He shot. He missed. The restaurant's wooden doors slid open. Jim stood outside as Yamamoto, Akira, and the Happy Foxes filed in. Kuda stayed with him. There was a chorus of shouting from within as the staff greeted the party in a ritualistic way. "We're leaving in the morning, Stafford," said Jim. "Everything's fine here. You?" "Pacific." Jim thought for a moment. "Is that a code word?" "Calm," said Stafford. "Right," said Jim. "It's not been calm here, but we're cool now. What is the plan?" "Can't say on the phone," said Jim. "But there is one, and it's short and sweet." "Good," said Stafford, "because Smith seems intent on camping here until he gets an explanation." He threw a glance at Smith, who was grinning laconically at him. "The blasted man has installed a television in the lounge." "Say hi to him for me," said Jim, smiling, one finger in his other ear to cut out the noise coming from the restaurant. "Any messages?" "No, sir," said Stafford. "Nothing from Jane? I can check your email again if you wish." Jim sighed. "No, that's okay." Chapter 62. Jim had drunk quite a lot of cold sake out of the square wooden box in front of him. He had also eaten quite a few odd things that the professor had explained to him. The chefs sat on a raised dais, with charcoal fires, meat, and vegetables in front of them. The diners sat around them like an audience, and picked out things to eat from the display. Yamamoto and Akira were choosing the dishes, and the waiters were constantly shouting orders to punctuate the proceedings. It was an enjoyable, if rather confusing, spectacle. Jim had started off with a sheet of roasted baby fish and a couple of oddly shaped mushrooms. That was followed by a red fish on a skewer that, even dead, looked pretty surprised. Next up was a plate of weird-tasting grilled pine nuts, which had the distinct but not unpleasant flavor of floor polish. They went down great with the sake. The professor and his happy fox seemed to have hit it off rather well. "Where did you disappear off to?" Jim asked Akira as the chef handed them a selection of what looked like potatoes on the end of a long wooden paddle. "I went to see if my father had successfully returned the Yasakani no Magatama." "And?" "He had handed it to the emperor himself." "Great," said Jim. "I bet you're relieved." "Very." "I've got a question for you," he said, sipping more of the delicious sake. "Who are the Happy Foxes?" "Very famous," he said. "They are celebrity bodyguards. They give protection to pop stars at events and nightclubs. Japanese fans are famously obsessive." "I could have told you that," whispered Kuda in his ear. He turned to her. "I'm sorry, I suppose you could have," he said. "So you're a bodyguard to the stars." "It's just showbiz," she said. "It's not enough to be good at your job. You have to look good, too." She smiled. "So what is your story, Englishman?" "The standard one. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl." "I know that story well. I like the beginning part very much." Jim wondered where Jane was. She was probably 40,000 feet up in the air, on her way back to Virginia, or in a bar somewhere with one of the SEALs, laughing about blowing stuff up. "What about the boy loses girl part?" he said. "That bit can be fun, too." Jim picked up a roasted giant sea snail. It tasted like a grilled action figure, but he could kind of imagine it might be really tasty to a starving person. "So what did you think about today's bit of action?" She seemed to consider a couple of different replies. "If we don't get thrown in jail, we will definitely be able to put our fees up." She swished her hair. Jim wondered what the tattoos appearing from under her outfit did below the line. He took out his sat phone. There was still no message from Jane. He switched it off. The professor was talking animatedly to his happy fox. They seemed very close. Kuda threw him a talk-to-me look. "So you don't mind unhappy endings?" he said. "The end of one story is the beginning of another," she said. The waiter was topping up Jim's box of sake. He wondered why Jane couldn't at least ping him an SMS. The simplest explanation was that she didn't give a damn. "Do you believe that the simplest answer to a tricky question is the right one?" he asked Kuda. She batted her beautiful eyes at him. "No," she said. "That's good," he said, switching the phone back on in the hope that when it synced up, a delayed message might suddenly beam down to him. The phone was running on its 3G circuit, or so it told him, so it was acting like a normal phone. The signal bars pulsed. Nothing. "You're sad," she said, taking his hand. "Jet lag." "Let's go for a drink after dinner," said Kuda. "My favorite bar is at the top of the Park Hyatt." "I'm staying there." "Wow," she said. "That's very convenient." A huddle of wealthy young Tokyoites were waiting to be seated at the bar's reception desk, and a long line snaked back to the elevators. Kuda, with Jim in tow, waltzed past it, and they were ushered straight to a table. The bar was a giant glass house, suspended in the clouds, an uplit, cavernous space with interesting shadows. Jim liked the science fiction film set atmosphere. Rain ran down the panes, sparkling like diamonds rolling over a mirror. They were assailed by a bevy of waiters who fawned on her, and by reflection him. She took off her tiny jacket, revealing a crazy sleeve tattoo of psychedelic undergrowth on her right arm. It was beautifully drawn, not the clumsy scribbling of the normal tattooist. A bottle of Dom Perignon Enoteca appeared and was poured. She leant forward so that her long, soft hair touched the side of his face. "So, what do you do when you are not having shootouts in Tokyo?" "I save the world." He smiled cheekily. "You know the kind of thing." "To saving the world." She raised her glass. "Kanpai." There was still light in the Love Hotel bedroom. Akira's eyes were accustoming fast, and he could see more than her shape. They had stopped kissing, and now she was taking his shirt off. He stood frozen. She would see his stunted arm in its awful naked state, the full horror of a hand reaching out where an arm ought to be. The dream would end. With every move she made to undress him, he felt as if his skin was being flayed. As she pulled the shirt off him, she was kissing his neck. He was rigid with tension as he waited for the inevitable signal of revulsion. His shirt was on the ground. She was kissing the fingers of his short hand. A shiver streamed through his whole body. No one had ever kissed it before, and from her lips he experienced hot shocks of pain and pleasure. He took her around the waist and lowered her onto the bed. He was enveloped in sensation, and his reason had left him. All he could feel was her. All he could hear was her breath. "No," said Jim, swaying down the corridor. "You can't come in. I've got to be up in 4 hours and heading for Narita." Kuda didn't reply, just giggled in the way Japanese women did to please their men. She stopped him, and they kissed. "I won't stay long," she said. She felt so good in his arms. Her perfume lured him. Her lips made love to his. She was pressing herself against him, and he could feel himself heading quickly to the point at which he would be unable to resist. "Look," he said, "that's my room down the hall, and I'm very sad to say I'm going in there on my own. I have my reasons, and you can probably guess them." He smiled sheepishly. "They don't make much sense to me right now, but I have to do the right thing. You understand?" She flicked his nose. "Okay," she said. "Your loss." "Yes," he said, "I'm sure of that." He made for the door, hoping for a clean getaway. He was having trouble finding his room key. When he looked back, she was gone. Idiot, he thought. We were 30 seconds away from a mind-blowing experience. His fingers registered the old-style metal key. He slotted it into the lock. There was a click. He pushed in against the strong door spring, struggling to extract the key. The lights were on. No doubt the bed was turned back and a little chocolate was waiting for him on his pillow. He started. Jane was in the bed, reading a book. She looked up. "What kept you?" Jim took a moment to collect his thoughts. He suddenly felt a bit too drunk to think straight. "I was drowning my sorrows." "What sorrows?" "My baby left me high and dry." "Too bad," she said. "What are you doing here?" "I'm not here. I'm at the embassy. Coming here would be a dumbass thing to do." "Right." He focused. "I'm having a shower." "Good idea." Chapter 63. Jim saw the professor waiting outside Virgin check-in on the concourse. He looked unusually relaxed and happy. "Good morning, Evan-san," he smiled boyishly. "Now to finish our historic quest." "It's a hell of a long cab ride to the airport," said Jim. "You look very cheerful today, Evan-san." "Really? I don't know why. I've only had about an hour's sleep." Narita Airport was a paragon of efficiency, and in a few minutes they were going through the formalities of leaving Japan. There was a parade of luxury stores inside the airport, but he knew buying anything for Jane was pointless. For one thing, he had no idea when he was going to see her again. His head was throbbing. He found himself in a shop selling strange candies. "These are very famous," said Akira. "Rice cakes." Jim squinted at the boxes and their exotic contents. "Rice cakes?" "Very delicious," said Akira. "Let's buy some for Stafford," said Jim, and wondered what his butler would make of them. "He will enjoy them, I'm sure." The Virgin Lounge at Narita continued the Austin Powers theme that had started in London and seemed to complement Jim's mild hangover. He was eating a sausage butty, and the professor was regarding his sushi as if he had to show it a little respect before he consumed it. "So," said Jim, swallowing a mouthful, "we get in first thing in the morning, go straight home, pick up the items, and take them straight to your embassy on Piccadilly. It opens at 10, but they will not be expecting us. I can't trust anyone but you with the plan." Akira sipped his green tea. "I have no idea where Stafford stashed them," said Jim, "but they must be relatively handy. The sooner we get hold of them, the better. They know you at the embassy, right?" "I will show them my letter if there is any delay," said Akira. "Once we are through the front door, I think we are safe." "I disagree," said Jim. "Once we've handed it over properly, we're home and dry. But on the wrong side of the counter, we may as well be out on the street." Kim sat at the back of the small HS-125 jet. They were refueling. Damascus had stayed open for him, and military fuel was being pumped into the tanks. His masters had friends, and their friends were only too happy to oblige him. He had refused pain relief from his doctors in Tokyo. He didn't want anything dulling his mind, and the pain in his ribs would spur him on. The nurse sat forwards in the galley and awaited his command, but no man had ever died from bruised ribs. The mirror and the sword had not yet been returned. He would smash his enemies into a pulp and take Kusanagi and the Yata no Kagami. The banks were calling his office incessantly as his stock price had failed to recover from its collapse. Rumors of the incident at his office had spread like wildfire, and the gossip was as bad as any front-page headline. To some extent, he had managed to hush it, but the mirage of his invincibility had vanished. He had to get the remaining pieces of regalia, or he was finished. Even one item would be enough to buy him out of his dire financial situation. If he could get both, his riches and power would multiply. It was a desperate gambit, but it had to work. Otherwise, his life was over. His best men awaited him in London. Jane was reviewing her email on the floor of the transport plane. She would have preferred a seat, but the floor would do. She had enjoyed the first hour or two, but now her butt needed something less Spartan. When she'd had enough of the hard floor, she would go for a walk and talk to the pilots. These days, some of them knew her by reputation, and that was a buzz. The trouble was, a question kept popping up in her mind, and no matter how she thought about it or responded to it, it wouldn't go away. It was like a furious itch that wouldn't be banished by scratching. The conundrum lay somewhere between, what the hell am I going to do with Jim, and what the hell am I meant to do with Jim? Ranking officers had husbands and wives, and they lived the Army life. It was a comfortable, normal, American existence in happy, well-kept communities. They went to church and followed college sports. They had barbecues and drank beer. They did charity work and held garage sales. They wore T-shirts, shorts, and flip-flops. Normal expectations didn't intersect with the Jim world. She was having the kind of does-not-compute moments that guys had with her. Going any further down the road with him would rip her world apart. He wouldn't turn into some dim, gentle, shrugging guy taking care of business while she shot off around the world blowing shit up. He wouldn't be sweating the money and the kids' education. How was she going to be in charge with him, Mr. Freaking Billionaire, successor designate to the legendary Max DeVass, the U.S. Treasury's own financial market manipulator? If she committed to Jim, she'd end up heading straight at a hell she had spent her whole adult life avoiding, the idea of a family being a guy and his little wife. She knew what her mom would say. She could even hear her voice in her head. Don't be a fool. What are you waiting for? You love him, so what's the issue? She knew what her dad would say, too. Duh, I mean, you don't want him? That strikes me as not the smartest thought you've ever had. When she had saved Jim's skin in the Congo, she had felt much closer to him. Now he had done the same for her in Tokyo. She felt out of control. She was staring at her email stack, her eyes unfocused. She blinked, then scanned the plane's no-nonsense skeletal interior. Stripped down was good. Complicated was bad. Her thing with Jim was complicated. Ergo. She wished she had a stick of gum to chew. It would help her think. Maybe the next time they were together, the whole thing would resolve itself. She closed the Apple Airbook, got up, and walked towards the flight deck. Stafford came into the lounge where Smith was watching the television. It would appear from this cryptic message that Jim will be back in the morning. Really? Said Smith. Can I see? If you must. Get the tea on, he read on. Very cryptic. I thought so, said Stafford. Do you think he got Jane out? I would imagine so, said Stafford, or his message would not have been so flippant. I could find out. What do you think? Can we wait to hear it from Jim himself? I'm expecting full disclosure, you know, said Smith, as if it was a punishment. I remember. And London is still crawling with Far Eastern miscreants, Smith goaded. I don't doubt you, said Stafford. I hope your explanations are going to live up to my expectations. Stafford closed his eyes. I can't possibly guess. Smith made an exasperated grumbling noise, then perked up. You wouldn't have a beer hidden away somewhere, would you, Stafford? I'm sure I can find one. Akira appeared at the end of Jim's upper-class cubicle. Jim pushed the monitor to one side. Evan-san, can I speak with you? Sure, said Jim, taking his foot off the little seat at the end of his plastic and leather-clad capsule. Akira sat down. I want to ask you something. He pulled out his mobile. He opened it and started hitting buttons with his thumb. He registered something and smiled. He turned the phone around and showed it to Jim. It was the happy fox he had been chatting with all night at the restaurant. Is she not very beautiful? Very, said Jim. Her name is Mitsu. Nice. I'm not a man of the world like you, Evan-san. I am an academic and a cripple. The word cripple rang harshly in Jim's ear. Do you think she and I can be together? Said Akira. I don't know, said Jim. Does she like you? Yes, he said. More than I could have hoped for. Jim was struggling to put the right question. Eventually, he came up with, Was she still liking you this morning? Yes. Well, said Jim, that's okay then. If she likes you that much, there's no reason she won't carry on liking you. Akira took the phone back and pressed a button with his thumb. The Happy Foxes are very famous celebrity outlaws, he said, showing Jim a glimpse of another picture, this time with Mitsu posing by a large custom bike. Does that mean trouble? Asked Jim, as Akira showed him another image of Mitsu pulled from the internet. For me, yes. For her, no. Akira flipped to another picture. Mitsu wasn't wearing much in the glamour shot Akira showed him next. Don't expect me to be any help, said Jim. My love life's a disaster. But Jane-san is your wonderful sweetheart, said Akira, suddenly concerned. Yes, said Jim. And you heroically rescued her from the evil man Kim. Jim sighed. Well, that's all well and manga, but the reality is, Professor, that I'm here and she isn't. Akira nodded. I feel that loss for the first time myself. He clutched his chest. It's a heavy sensation. Jim took the phone from Akira and looked at the next picture he had selected. Mitsu was skimpily clad in leather pants with a tight T-shirt and was again draped over some alien motorbike. The professor clearly had no clue what he was getting himself into. Nice motorbike, he said. Would you like to see more? Jim stifled a sigh. Sure. How many have you got? Many.